Well, hello again, everybody, and welcome to the final theme of today's More Than Sound Symposium. And it is my great pleasure to facilitate this session with our two international keynote presentations by Gascia Ouzounian from Oxford University and Marcel Cobussen from Leiden University. Welcome to both of you, and good morning. I believe it is 8 a.m. in the UK and 9 a.m. in the Netherlands, and we thank you for taking the time to be here today. Both Marcel and Gascia are delivering their keynotes, which of course is unusual at the last session of the day, but obviously because of where they are located, this was the best time to put them in the session order. So thanks again. So by way of introduction, I'd just like to say a few words about the Sonic Cities theme, and I'm going to be very brief because I've already spoken a lot today, and really want to hear what Gascia and Marcel have to say, and the questions that people may have for them. But I'll just provide a brief introduction from my own perspective as someone who is working in this area. So Sonic Cities, of course, refers to the sounds of a city, that which can be felt, heard, and apprehended by the senses. It refers also to any and all conversations about how our cities should sound, and that which is, as yet, unheard. The idea that city sounds are something that can be designed and or transformed are most well recognised in R. Murray Schafer's work with the World Soundscape Project. And again, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the sad news of his passing this year, and also the powerful and enduring influence he has had on the field of urban soundscape design. Activity in urban sound research has seen an exponential rise in the last 15 years or so. In acoustics, for instance, there are research projects being led by Catherine Guastavino at McGill University and Jian Kang and Francesco Aletta at the University of London. And the International Organisation for Standardisation has recently agreed on a set of international standards that define soundscape as a concept, including methods for data collection and analysis. The design of soundscapes, however, is driven largely by urban designers, landscape architects and sound artists, though I hasten to add the interdisciplinary projects of the above-mentioned soundscape researchers, Guastavino and Kang and Aletta, also include such interdisciplinary practitioners. In the arts and humanities, there has also been much growth in the theory and practice of sonic urbanism, growth and much divergence, I should say, as well. It's a domain, broadly speaking, that our two keynotes practice within and have made powerful contributions. A significant question for this domain is the role sound artists have in our understanding, comprehension, and also the possible transformation of our cities. There are a number of key historical influences to note in this discussion, but I would like to foreground here Max Neuhaus's 1977 Times Square and his 1960s and 1970s city-based listening walks. These present key insights into what sound artists can contribute to urban soundscape design efforts. Neuhaus's work, like that of many sound artists working with urban sound, takes an interest in what already exists and the ways in which existent sound as a material can be worked with to reconfigure our experience of space. Of course, there are now many sound artists working in an urban context, too vast to cover here. But given this proliferation of interest in the topic of sonic intervention, a key question must now be asked. And it's the question that was recently posed by the Sonic Aggregator Project, which is a collaboration of Tuned City, with a key member being Peter Cusack, and Soundtrack City, with a key member being Michael Huisman. And I think, Marcel, that I have mispronounced his name, and I hope you'll correct it if I have. This is a project in Berlin, and they are asking this key question: who has the right to decide how our urban environment should sound? So I'll finish my brief introduction there and turn now to our two wonderful presenters. Both Gascia and Marcel have extensive experience working with sound artists in city spaces, both directly and indirectly in theoretical and practical contexts. Their work has had a big influence on my own research, and so it is a great pleasure to hand over to them and to hear their thoughts on the subject of sonic cities. After their presentations, we will have time for questions, and I would encourage you to please send any and all questions via the YouTube channel at any time, and they will be forwarded to me by Ari. So firstly, I would like to welcome Gascia Ouzounian. Gascia is Associate Professor of Music at the University of Oxford, where she directs the 5-year project Sonorous Cities toward a Sonic Urbanism, which is funded by the European Research Council. Her work is concerned with the philosophies, technologies and aesthetic ideologies that shape ideas of sound and space, most recently in Stereophonica, Sound and Space in Science, Technology and the Arts, printed in 2021 by MIT Press, published and printed, I should say. Ouzounian is founder and artistic director of Optophono, which publishes interactive music and sound art. Recent projects in the area of sound and urbanism include Scoring the City, which began in 2020 and is ongoing. It explores experimental notations for urban design, and also Acoustic Cities, London and Beirut in 2019, in which 10 artists created works that responded to the acoustic conditions of London and Beirut. Gascia, thanks so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Jordan. I just wanted to give a very warm thanks for your invitation, as well as all the care and attention that you've taken in hosting today's event, and also to thank the team at RMIT for everything they're doing to facilitate. It's been really wonderful, and to thank also my fellow presenters and everyone who's here today. So my talk is called Urban Sonic Cartographies, the Sonic Countermapping of Cities. And as Jordan mentioned, I'm based at the University of Oxford, where I'm running a project called Sonorous Cities towards a sonic urbanism, with a really fantastic team of postdoctoral researchers as well as collaborators in different places. So if you'd like to learn more about that project, we're starting to document it at soncities.org. So first, I'd like to give an introduction to histories of sound mapping and noise mapping. I'll make that fairly brief. But what I wanted to say was that in the academic literature so far to date, sound mapping and noise mapping have principally been discussed in relation to things like their typologies, genealogies, their underlying technologies, as well as representational strategies. So how are they communicating what they are communicating? And by contrast, today I want to look at sonic counter-mapping projects. So sound maps that produce counter-narratives of urban spaces or communities, mapping projects that reveal aspects of the city that might otherwise remain unknown, and that in some cases I think also challenge wider epistemologies in soundscape studies or sound studies more broadly. Jordan very kindly mentioned that I published a book this year, which is called Stereophonica, Sound and Space in Science, Technology and the Arts. And in that book, I have a chapter on noise mapping, in which I'm looking at the visual and textual roots of noise mapping in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So when I say kind of textual, I'm referring to things like the vast increase in the kinds of data collection that cities were doing, municipal authorities, so things like noise complaints as well as noise reports on cities during this time. If you look at the collection, for example, by the medical officers of health in London, there were these quite detailed reports on noise in relation to various districts in London, and some of them are so detailed enough in terms of what they're describing that it's almost like a proto kind of verbal noise map. And those reports also came with recommendations for how to punish various noise offenses. So they became linked to the ways in which noise legislation happened and changed. At first, eliminating specific noise events, and then eventually kind of doing more global treatments of city noise. So reducing noise through the implementation of things like quiet zones and quiet areas, which we still do today. That was also a time in which there were many new different graphic representations of noise. One of those types of representations of noise that I talk about in the book is our decibel charts, in which often they were mapping, scientists and engineers were mapping common urban noises in connection to city districts and streets. And I make the argument there that when a decibel chart was connected to urban soundscapes, it started to produce the idea, or kind of support the idea, of the city as a manufacturer of noise and as a site that could be meaningfully described in relation to noise levels. So around this time, you start to have the emergence of the idea of the sonic city or acoustic city as a site that could and should be monitored, regulated, and even policed, specifically in relation to noise levels. This is another kind of visual representation of an urban noise environment. This is the kind of topographical map of noise levels. This one is from 1938. It's the earliest one of its kind that I found. This one is a German project. It's showing the loudness chart of a Berlin district of Charlottenburg. But that's still the kind of representation that we use in noise mapping today. And noise mapping, as you all know, is now legislated on a mass scale. In Europe, we have the Environmental Noise Directive of 2002, which governs how noise maps and then strategic action plans in response to those noise maps are produced. But what I would say is that maybe the major innovations in noise mapping in the last maybe 20 years or so are things like participatory noise mapping, in which individuals are capturing and sharing data relating to their own noise exposure, for example, by using their mobile phone as they're walking down a city street. And here the conceit is, quote unquote, people-centric processes, so democratizing processes around noise management and engaging citizens in issues of noise. If you go to New York City today, you might run into one of these posters. This is a photo that I took about 2 years ago, I think. And it just says, recording underway. NYU researchers with support of the National Science Foundation are investigating New York City street noise to reduce noise pollution. Again, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this major project, which is called Sonic, Sounds of New York City. And this is another kind of, let's say, innovation in noise mapping. So what they are doing, it's a large-scale urban noise monitoring project, which is based at NYU. And they have installed these quite cheap and durable sensors, microphones across Manhattan, mostly in lower Manhattan, which are capturing brief snippets of audio throughout the day and night. And then they've built a machine learning algorithm, which is identifying those sounds that are picked up by the sensors. So it will, tell you whether it's a dog barking or the sounds of traffic. And it can also tell you how confident it is in making that estimation. And they also invite people to train those algorithms. So people are also listening in that sense. And if you read their publications, you learn that the ideal kind of noise map that they would produce is one that would dynamically visualize in real time changes in noise level variance across the city, both in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, so horizontally as well as vertically as you're going up and down in city floors, let's say. And it would be able to identify those noises in real time. So while that might still be somewhat out of reach because the problems around, let's say, capturing, annotating, and visualizing that kind of large data set is quite complex. Here, the conceit is to enable better and faster decision-making by city authorities around the issue of noise, as well as a more efficient implementation of noise policy. As with many cities, by the time a noise complaint is investigated, it's usually not useful to the person making the complaint. So that's the conceit around projects like Sonic. But maybe a question that is not fully addressed is the potential of systems like that to be used for purposes of sonic surveillance, for example, but also maybe this kind of more subtle question around what kind of communities or collectivities is a project like this, Imagining. So here I've quoted from Jennifer Gabris's program Earth, which is on this idea of citizen sensing through these kinds of urban monitoring systems. And she says, what are the implications for wiring up environments in these ways, and how does the sensor actuator logic implicit in these kinds of monitoring technologies not only program environments, but also program the sorts of citizens and collectives that might concretize through these processes? And I think that's an important question. So if you think of the kind of citizen who is being imagined by a project like Sonic, this is the citizen as an informant. It's somebody who's reporting on noise infringements. And it's also the listener as sensor, somebody who is identifying types of noises when they're annotating those machine listening algorithms. And perhaps there's a link there to be made between sensor and sensor, since ultimately the goal of a system like this is noise mitigation. And I've made the argument in Stereophonica, which I kind of trace in a deeper level there, that noise mapping, which is the principal route through which many municipal authorities consider the sonic urban environment, is important for us as scholars to think about, not only in relation to what noise maps represent, but equally because of the material effects that noise mapping has had upon urban environments as well as the communities who inhabit them. Noise mapping is kind of like the official, let's say, representation of the acoustic city. There's many thousands which are produced across the world. Every year, noise mapping today is also quite expensive. In London in 2004, it cost something like £13 million to produce noise maps of the city. The more, let's say, unofficial or alternative form of urban cartography, which is very vibrant and active today, I would say is happening in the realm of, both noise mapping. There are interesting projects there, but also sound mapping. And by the sound map, I'm referring to mainly qualitative versus quantitative mappings of the acoustic city. So maps which are representations of sounds and soundscapes versus noise levels. And there's no standard typology for these. I'm sure many of you have come across different kinds. There's the beautiful Listening to Bonn handheld map that Sam Auenger produced for Bonn Hören. That's one which is, you can take physically and go around the city and discover unique acoustic features of Bonn. There are also maps like this, which is a very early project by the members of the World Soundscape Project, who Jordan mentioned the sad passing of Armory Schaefer. So this was a map of sounds that they heard between 11 a.m. and 11:30 on one day from a hillside about 500 meters beyond the village of Bissingen. So this is part of their 5-village soundscape project, which was published in 1977. And as you can see, this is one of kind of Schaefer's early interventions into sonography, so sonic notations. And you can see that they're, trying to deal with this tension of capturing a dynamic phenomenon like sound and the movement of sound in physical space. So you can see, for example, there are continuous sounds and intermittent sounds, but they also have a direction. So the jets are moving from here to there. These different sounds are located in different places. Some of them are ongoing and some of them are happening intermittently. And their influence continues, I think, to be felt in projects, for example, like the Montreal Sound Map. So there's a proliferation of online sound maps of cities, many of which invite members of the general public to contribute sound recordings of places. So in this case, different environmental recordings of Montreal are collected, archived on this website. And what they write, and it's a very Schaeferian idea, is we aim for people to experience the complexity and lure of the soundscape firsthand. This promotes a more optimistic approach to acoustic ecology, another idea which was promulgated by the World Soundscape Project, encouraging listeners to lend a musical ear to the soundscape. And again, Schaefer had the idea of the soundscape as a musical composition. And on the website, you can experience that, and you can even play it as a composition, as a kind of randomly evolving autoplay, let's say, urban soundscape composition. So I'm just going to play a 1-minute video from the Montreal Sound Map. Okay, so the reason I wanted to play that was just to show the kinds of information they're collecting as well, the kinds of metadata, as well as, the controls, the functionalities of their project. So, but I would like to move into this other, maybe potentially newer kind of phase of sound mapping as I see it, as it's maturing into this kind of more self-reflexive way of working. And here I'm quoting from Milena Drumeva's Sound Mapping as Critical Cartography, in which she proposes this idea of a critical sound mapping, a kind of sound mapping that questions the normative logics embedded in the practice of sound mapping. And she identifies those normative logics as consisting of this kind of high quality field recording, a branch of high fidelity culture that operates, she finds, as a masculine technological domain. And then if you look at Samuel Tholen's Sound Maps Matter, he finds a similar kind of normative logic operating in sound mapping practices. So he examines these three sound mapping platforms, FreeShare, Audio Boom, and Radio Appareil, and he suggests that they support an approach to sound mapping that favors pinning high fidelity indexical audio recordings to a seemingly neutral base layer. So then if we look at other critiques of sound mapping, those critiques have been posed for some time. This is an article which I highly recommend, a very early, let's say, critical intervention by Jacqueline Waldock called Sound Mapping Critiques and Reflections, which is published in Marcel's Journal of Sonic Studies. And she writes, if sound maps are a permanent researchable resource like the UK Sound Map, an auditory archive of an environment like the Montreal Sound Map, a historical record and subjective representation of the city, as claimed by the New York Sound Seeker, then what is being constructed, she says, in many cases is a male-dominated record of sound, an insight into the significance of sound from a normative perspective. So here, if we're thinking about, going into more critical or radical kinds of cartographies, ones that think about mapping as practice, the knowledge it deploys, and the political field of its operations. So what kinds of projects emerge at that intersection, let's say, of critical cartography and sound mapping? And I'd like to just look at a few. The first one is Ali Martin's Go-Go Music and Displacement in Washington, D.C. So since 2015, Ali Martin, a scholar and ethnomusicologist, is creating a series of maps that chart how go-go music, what she calls a Black indigenous subgenre of funk, which emerged in DC, has been displaced as a result of urban gentrification. So her project alighted with a movement which was called Don't Mute DC, which was an anti-gentrification movement specifically around sound and sonic cultures and public spaces in DC. And I'm just going to play a very short video to show what that refers to.
Don't Mute DC is a movement.
Message to policymakers.
Bridging the gap between music and politics. Saying not just don't mute the music.
We don't all have to be San Francisco.
We're saying don't mute us.
This is my song right here.
Go-go is the most important thing in DC, period.
All it took to get them to listen was throwing a lot of go-go concerts and protests. We should have done this a long time ago.
Several black businesses that are being attacked by gentrifiers. We're just talking about people who move in and don't care about us and think they're entitled to things that we're not entitled to.
We out here in Florida right now because my boy Donald, man, is under attack.
Today is go-go, tomorrow it's going to be you.
will continue on 7th and Florida Avenue.
Saved, close to $100 million in cuts directly targeted at Black communities in D.C. Fabric of the community is being ripped apart, and events like this are things that will help us to start healing.
It's a place for all of us to bring our cultures, our history.
It's an adjustment period.
They can't turn down the go-go. That's just our life, go-go.
This movement means that we have hope that we won't be erased from Washington.
One DC, one America. That's how I got to be.
So I want to, that gives you a sense of, the purpose of this movement, and it's also, for me, very fascinating, and this is something which Ali Martin is examining in a lot of depth in her work. This is a movement that was really sparked by a noise complaint and the politics around noise management in a shared urban space. So what her mapping project did was, there was a series of maps. In the first one, she shows how go-go venues she charts go-go venues against the Black population percentage of the city for 3 years across 3 decades, 1990, 2000, and 2010. She shows there how go-go venues in the city have closed while the Black population in the city decreases and the median income increases. And then in her second map, she uses time-lapse technology to show the opening and closing of go-go venues in DC over that 50-year period. And this map, for me, I thought was quite a powerful representation because it shows how go-go venues were pushed out of the city center to its outskirts. So in a sense, it's revealing the kind of violence which is taking place through gentrification, the unpredictability of these kinds of displacements, through the unpredictability of the movements that it depicts. And I just want to show you a screen grab of that second series of maps. So you can see this now as a video. So that's depicting the movement of go-go music venues over that 50-year period. And I'm just going to play that again, just because it goes by quite quickly. So during earlier decades, go-go music venues enjoyed relative stability, and venues are clustered together in central locations, implying a kind of community. And as gentrification intensifies, those venues are displaced seemingly in more random ways, kind of popping on and off the map in unpredictable ways, and in ways that no longer implies connection or closeness to other venues. So, this is a kind of visual representation of a displaced community, as well as it's getting faster and more unpredictable. So a project like this, you could say, belongs to this very rich tradition of data visualization by Black artists, scholars, and activists, which you could trace as early as the early 1900s by someone like W.E. Du Bois, who used data visualization to illuminate the conditions of what he called a nation within a nation at the 1900 Paris Exposition. It also belongs to a growing tradition of mapping musical cities. Here I've taken a photo from the website Interactive Music Mapping Vienna led by Professor Susanne Zafke. And this is a fascinating project which is reconstructing the kind of sonic dimensions of Vienna in the 20th century, in the post-war period, using things like neglected archival documents. You also have musical maps of cities like the Dublin Music Map, which is showing, for example, where this is more like a tourist project. It's pointing people towards kind of musical haunts in Dublin. So there are many examples of musical city maps. But what I would say is, for a project like Ali Martin's, her project is not necessarily concerned with cataloging or conserving or preserving or reproducing urban sonic or musical heritages, as many of these projects are. It's not thinking about musical tourism, or as some do. I'm not saying that the Dublin Music Map does that. Many, however, do produce these kind of skewed musical nostalgias. So they uplift certain kinds of narratives about music in the city to the exclusion of others. As much as it is aiming to reveal how these uneven processes of gentrification are impacting upon musical as well as musico-ethnic communities, and how those displacements are mediated by race and class. So Ali Martin has this idea that she has developed on intersectional listening, what she describes as attending to the sonically articulated expressions of identity that are present in processes of gentrification, producing an analysis that attends to the complexities of sound, power, and race in a changing city. And she sees her project specifically in activist terms as well. So for her, this intersectional listening, is trying to, reveal how these dynamics are produced. And what I would say is that a project like this is posing some, for me, quite interesting challenges to how sound mapping has developed, and also to soundscape studies more broadly, in which soundscape projects often are concerned with indexing sonic environments, so the quote-unquote sounds that can be heard in a place, and often are geared towards collecting, recording, cataloging, and analyzing those sounds. And of course, in acoustic ecology, it's often about preserving or conserving sonic environments, or assessing the acoustic health of an environment. Here, she's looking rather at urban soundscapes as contested sites, in this case, whose contests are framed in connection to racialized and classed definitions of noise. So it starts to bring forward this idea of soundscape as a product of social and economic relations. So whereas in soundscape studies, the predominating logic is that of soundscape as object, that thing that you can catalog and analyze and preserve and conserve, she's really thinking about, I think, the idea of soundscape as product, so as a kind of social and cultural production, which asks us also to consider not only which sounds are present in a city, but why they are present or absent. So what are the social, political, economic forces that enable certain soundscapes to develop, to remain, perhaps to become the dominant soundscapes of a place, or else that force their early demise. And so here, soundscape analysis is not necessarily about indexing those sounds of an environment, but examining the social, political, and economic basis of sonic and social productions. And a project like hers, I think, also shows us, and I should say it's much more extensive, her study. I've only kind of shown a small aspect of it. But that belonging in the acoustic city, as we saw with that Don't Mute DC movement, is not something that merely happens, but is something that is governed and legislated. It can be supported or suppressed by city authorities, whether city councillors or lawmakers or the police, responding to noise complaints, for example. But the acoustic city can also be a site of resistance, as that Don't Mute DC movement shows us. So now I'd like to show a different sonic counter mapping project, what I consider a kind of counter mapping. And this is a project by the Italian artist Anna Raimondo, and she's called it New Boundaries of the Well-Being of Vaginal Ecosystem. This is the first one in Rome, but she's done this in quite a few cities, I think 6 or 7 cities now, since 2017. And this is a feminist project, and what the curator Lucrezia Cipitelli has said about it is that Anna Raimondo is asking a group of women of many different ages, sexual orientations, classes, genders, cultures, and origins to describe the city through the feelings caused by the spaces they inhabit, memories, stories, and history. So she records those testimonies, and it becomes a kind of auditory drift in the body of a woman, a remapping of the city. And so in this case, in Rome, they've all taken different forms, but the Rome one, there was this sound installation in this space, as well as a map, as well as a recording on vinyl. And this is what the map looked like. It's a, capturing excerpts of those responses by women about how they experience the city as a gendered space. And I'm going to play a quick video from this documenting that installation.
Io entravo in via della Conciliazione, mi trovavo davanti il cupolone del Vaticano, acceleravo spingendo a tavoletta e andavo a tutta velocità immaginando che in cima alla macchina, come se fosse stato un pick-up della Toyota, con un RPG montato sopra, avrei sparato un missile contro il cupolone per distruggere questo nemico, come dire attenzione perché il vostro nemico è qui, io sono presente.
Medico di un ospedale religioso le ha chiesto quanti uomini ha avuto nella sua vita.
So this is also then a kind of detail of the, first one that we heard from the woman who is describing her experience of driving in front of the Vatican and what she was imagining as she was there. So this project was specifically in response to the work of the feminist geographer Gillian Rose, who wrote the book Feminism and Geography, The Limits of Geographical Knowledge, which challenges the implicit whiteness, maleness, and Eurocentrism of geography's supposedly neutral mappings, territories, and epistemologies. It's an early work in that kind of area. And Rose draws attention in her project to the centrality of the visual to claims to geographical knowledge, a visualism whereby seeing and knowing are often conflated, she writes. And so her discussion of what she calls the geographer's gaze is drawing on the work of cultural geographers who suggest that the gaze at landscape is, quote, a visual ideology because it uncritically shows only the relationship of the powerful to their environment. So I think we're now familiar with that idea of the gaze. But there are maybe parallels there to be made to soundscape recording traditions in which historically it's been, a maybe more privileged domain in which the white male recordist's often inaudible body, absented body, is capturing a kind of exotic acoustic scene. So maybe there is a parallel to be made there between the geographer's gaze and the field recordist's ear. So if we go back to Drumeva's ideas of the normative logics of sound mapping, what we find in sound mappings of cities is what is often mapped is typically the sounds of those quote-unquote public spaces that have historically been male-dominated, where, let's say, men of a certain class, perhaps ethnicity, feel more welcome or safe. But what Raimondo is doing is she's building a counter-narrative of the city by asking women to share their experiences, and what often emerges are shared experiences of marginalization, harassment, and different forms of exclusions from the city. So this is kind of like what Leslie Kern describes in her book Feminist City, in which she's talking about the importance of asking women's questions, she says, not essentialist questions based on some false claim to a biological definition of womanhood, but rather questions that emerge from the everyday embodied experience of those who include themselves in that dynamic and shifting category of women. And so then what emerges is maybe something more like a social sonic cartography. And that's something I can see emerging in more of these kinds of sonic countermapping projects. They're telling social as well as sonic stories. I'm going to give two more examples and then conclude for now, let's say. This one is by Lawrence Abu Hamdan, now a very influential sound artist and activist. And he is his project Saidnaya, the Missing 19 dB, which he did in collaboration with Amnesty International and the group Forensic Architecture. So for this project, he was collecting ear witness testimonies from survivors of a very brutal military prison, which was near Damascus in Syria, where over 13,000 people had been executed since 2016. And what Amnesty International was doing was trying to recreate, do a kind of mapping of the prison, because of course it was off-site, off limits to observers. So it was inaccessible. And also prisoners had been kept in darkness. They were blindfolded or made to cover their eyes. So Lawrence Abu Hamdan was collecting ear witness testimonies to help reconstruct the prison's architecture, he writes, and gain insight to what is happening inside. So both their memories of the sounds they heard as well as the acoustics of the prison, and that fed into that Amnesty International report. Another, I think, interesting example is Samuel Thulin's Sounding Desert Utopias, now a very maybe different kind of counter mapping, which is looking more at even the normative logics in mapping at large. What this project is a composition which was made using audio files that were accidentally geotagged in the middle of the Libyan desert on freesound.org. So that kind of accidental sound mapping, that's challenging this totalizing logic and perhaps the presumed infallibility of GIS, which dominates so much mapping, so many kinds of mapping systems today. And it's asking the question, what does it mean to locate? And in particular, what does it mean to locate sound? So this is a reference to the writing of William Rankin, who's done a lot of work in critical cartography. And what he says is that radical in relation to mapping can refer to the way the map is made. It would be a radical process rather than just radical content. It's the way the map is drawn, or perhaps in this case, produced or constructed, that makes the political intervention. Historically, we've had, sound maps as well as noise maps that treat the acoustic city as a kind of neutral site, that neutral base layer of the city. And what I find emerging in these kinds of more critically oriented sound mapping projects, they reveal that acoustic city is an unstable site, a site of contests. For example, in Ali Martin's project, where certain social and economic interests are upheld and others are repressed. So acoustic mappings can be representations of those sites as well as expressions of those contests. And they often are, even if they're unconsciously so, they're often representing that. But what kinds of things can emerge through these kinds of works? Perhaps alternative epistemologies of the acoustic city and understandings of that site, works that resist or counter official narratives of cities and communities that give us insights into processes like gentrification or population displacement, works that resist those normative logics of sound mapping and noise mapping, for example, that kind of high quality field recording technical culture, that the recordings of male-dominated spaces and public spaces. Waldock has drawn attention to that missing kind of sense of domestic soundscapes, for example, in cities, which don't appear on many sound maps, or works that are resisting that trope, not reproducing that trope of the field recordist's ear. They might emerge as social cartographies. They might engage intersectional listening. They might also challenge those dominant spatial logics and mapping systems, for example, the idea of the kind of totalizing Euclidean space in which anything can be located anywhere, as is a kind of underlying logic in GIS systems. So projects in which not only what the map represents is important, but also the process of mapping is also questioned. So my question really is, how might sonic countermappings transform what we understand about acoustic cities and the urban more broadly? In what ways might they challenge sonic epistemologies, underlying sound studies and sonic arts practices, as well as the visualism that underlies urbanism and urban geography? Can they bring about a kind of, can we develop maybe a more critical appreciation of the oral regimes as well as the visual regimes that govern these kinds of practices, and how might they also intervene into urban sonic practices at large. So those are maybe some questions that I'll leave us with for now. And just to say thank you again to Jordan, and I'm going to wrap there. I wanted to also just thank the ERC who are funding our research project, and to say that if anyone wishes to, we're going to be hosting online workshops and things like that. And if you would like to get in touch, we have a newsletter that you can sign up to if you go to our website and contact. And that way you can keep in touch and also perhaps participate in something that we'll be hosting. So I will wrap there for now.
Well, thank you, Gascia. That was mind-expanding and an incredibly thoughtful and detailed presentation. As I was listening to you, I was thinking about the representational power of maps, which you clearly elucidated, and the radical ways in which people are breaking down those traditional approaches to mapping in terms of what it reveals about race and gender issues and so forth. It's incredibly important stuff. And as you were presenting, I was thinking here in Australia, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies released in 1996 a new map of Australia that, rather than being the 6 states and the 2 territories that England defined, was actually broken up into the many language groups of the Aboriginal nations, and there was around 200. And I think that was a real shift in the consciousness here of how we perceived this continent. It's the, as you discuss, the power of mapping and how it can shift our thinking. So thank you very much for your presentation. Looking forward to a discussion about that. And I'm sure that there's lots of interesting people watching this with interesting responses, and I'd appreciate being able to relay your questions too. And I now want to hand over, and it is my great pleasure to do so, to Marcel Cobussen. Marcel Cobussen studied jazz piano and art and cultural studies, and is currently full professor of auditory culture and music philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. He is author of several books, among them the upcoming Everyday Sounds and Sonic Materialism in 2022, which I'm greatly looking forward to reading. He is editor-in-chief of the open access online journal of Sonic Studies, and I should say I'm the associate editor of this journal, so in some ways Marcel is my boss. Not quite, but in some ways, yes. Marcel, thank you so much for being here, and over to you for the final presentation of today.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can be with us for another 30 minutes, in which I will be mainly talking and not showing that many slides nor AV materials. Nevertheless, I hope that it will be enough interest for you. From my former rector magnificus of Leiden University in the Netherlands, I learned that the audience will mostly, if not only, remember the first couple of minutes of a presentation. So I will start with an extremely brief summary of the point that I would like to make today. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, thank you. What I have to give to you today, my gift, my modest contribution to this symposium, is A, that the role of sound artists in designing or redesigning public urban spaces is indispensable, and B, perhaps more important, that their input doesn't necessarily have to be artistic in the narrow sense. And in order to underpin these two statements, I'll introduce the term non-art, thereby trying to create a more extensive role for sound artists, namely to raise awareness, to encourage engagement and imagination, and to instigate care and responsibility. And all this in and through sound. So as Jordan already said, I'm full professor of auditory culture at Leiden University since November 2016. And becoming a full professor in the Netherlands involves an official ceremony during which newly appointed professors give so-called inaugural lectures. So somewhere in May 2016, I decided that mine would be about sound and sound art in public urban spaces. And I had perhaps the inappropriate idea that I could add something to already existing discourses. So after rereading works of top dogs such as Murray Schafer, Brandon Nobel, Jian Kang, I came quite accidentally actually across a writer I had never heard of before. The book was called Sonic Rupture, and the author is hosting this symposium. While reading that work, I got the rather unpleasant experience that someone else had just investigated, analyzed, and written down the ideas that I thought were my own, innovative, and extremely important. So, thanks, Jordan, for the invite. But in fact, also this presentation will not deviate much from what you already reflected upon in Sonic Rupture. And this is actually just a different way of saying thanks to Jordan for destroying the illusion that I had some original ideas. Okay, so I'm supposed to say something smart about sonic cities, or to make it a bit easier for myself, sound in and of the cities in a symposium named More Than Sound. Can I have a next slide, please? An interesting title, More Than Sound. True as well, perhaps especially in relation to public urban spaces. The question, what sounds, where the sounds come from, who or what produces the sounds, and why they are sounding, of course, can deal and have to deal, as I will explain later, with the intrinsic qualities of sound. But, and that was also stressed by Gascia in the previous lecture, but they immediately and simultaneously transcend the sonic parameters such as pitch, frequency, rhythm, etc. What can be heard in a city is, of course, also the result of architectural and political decisions and preferences, of urban planning that invites certain types of interaction between humans, between things, and between humans and things, at the expense of others. In short, how a city or parts of a city sound is always already influenced by certain political, social, and economic activity. And also the geographical position, weather conditions, seasons, time of the day, time of the week, co-determine what can be heard at a certain moment on a certain place. In addition, how a city sounds depends on many non-sounding physical agents as well. Narrow alleys or broad avenues, facades made of glass, concrete or wood, cycle paths or motorways, the amount of green and blue, etc. Conversely, how a city sounds doesn't only depend on these factors. An existing or expected sonic environment also determines to a certain extent the social, economic, and other interactions that will take place. So, talking about a sonic city is always already talking about more than simply the sounds of a city. However, it remains necessary to talk about sound itself, especially in public urban contexts. A good friend of mine and an internationally recognized sound and multimedia artist, Edwin van der Heijden, currently has one of his works exposed at the Public Art Biennial in the Netherlands. And whereas people rather easily accept visual interventions in their everyday environment, especially when they are temporary, Edwin immediately got negative reactions from residents who were exposed to his sound sculpture, audible between June till September, daily between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. Well, in order to hear anything, you had to press a certain button, and then you have a soundscape composition for approximately 1.5 minutes. And of course, the complaints were about loudness. So although I tend to agree with Jonathan Stern's objections against the audiovisual litany, that is, against the separation of the two and against visual dominance, it seems that people are more sensitive to certain changes in their sonic environment than to interventions in the visual domain. Now, the point I'll try to make today is how these basic observations formed, informed, and transformed my work as an academic, as an artist, and more recently as what I would call a politician or a negotiator. And to do so, I will focus on a few ongoing projects I'm doing in the city center of my hometown, Rotterdam. The center was bombed in 1940 by Nazi Germany. And after World War II, they rebuilt it, anticipating some future developments. One being the increase of motorized traffic. Since 2018, the policy had to be altered due to the influence of climate change and environmental issues. Can you go to the next slide now, please? The keywords are now ecology, biodiversity, and sustainability. And within this context, the City Council has selected 7 spaces in the center that should undergo some fundamental changes. Interestingly, they also acknowledge the role of sound, and more specifically, sound as experienced by the residents and users of these spaces. So together with some sound artists, I am responsible for proposing concrete ideas for these 7 spaces to improve their overall acoustic quality. And as said before, changing the sonic environment also affects the social, economic, political, and even ethical aspects of public spaces. Now, it is not my aim to go into detail into 1 or 2 of these projects, but to speak in more general terms about our ways of working, our methodology, as well as the results, that is, the type of recommendations we've made and how we have made them. Next slide, please. Regarding our research method, we started simply by visiting the sites, by listening to them, and by making recordings at different days and different times of the day. We did the usual measurements, decibels, dBA, LDEN, data collections, etc. We organized sound walks and a sound workshop. We held interviews, and we had a questionnaire on the City Council's website. Now, the measurements proved what we already experienced during our own sound walks. The majority of the sites sound pretty terrible due to the dominance of motorized traffic, cars and trams, and the warning signals. But it became more interesting when we started doing sound walks with others, for example, the architects responsible for the visual redesign, with urban planners, project leaders, residents, and civil servants responsible for example, public transport, mobility, sound policy, etc. It was interesting for more than one reason. First, even the civil servants responsible for the sound policy never went to these sites to just listen. So when we asked them while being there, what do you hear? Their first reaction was, huh? What are you saying? I can't hear you, because of the motorized traffic. The second example, while walking and listening there, we had already noticed that the warning signals for the trams also beeped when there was no tram in sight. When mentioning this to the civil servants of mobility, they assured us that nothing was wrong. But when they came for the sound walk, they concluded that the system was not functioning properly, and that this malfunctioning must have been going on for years already. In short, these sound walks led to an enormous shift in consciousness. The questionnaires were quite successful, often filled in by over 1,000 people. So besides the normal multiple choice questions, it also contained open questions, for example, about the wishes and desires for the future sounding of these sites. We didn't expect too much, and we were completely surprised that many people wrote more than half a page to provide us with ideas. For the workshop, we invited residents, project leaders, civil servants, the architects, urban planners, and the sound artists that were involved in each of the projects. That is, all kinds of people that were somehow directly involved with the redevelopment of the site, but who never met in such a heterogeneous group. There, we presented for the first time some sound files, some sonic impressions of how the site could sound in the future. And this brings me to the presentation of our analysis and recommendation. Can I go to the next slide, please? So what we did in our presentation was to imitate more or less what architects do. They provide and entice policymakers with more or less ideal pictures. And one is shown here on the left side. Whereas on architectural brochures, the sun is always shining, trees are always green, and families are always smiling, we first presented, in a bit exaggerated way, the sound files of the current situation, followed by a few sonic impressions as to how it might sound after the sonic makeover. So let's listen first to a sound file we recorded, which should somehow represent the current situation. So this is the current situation. We now go to our sonic impression of how it could sound in the future. So as I said, although a bit exaggerated, especially the second sound file is really based on the design of the architects, with a fountain in the middle, and there are still some trams and traffic to hear. But yeah, it sounds rather different from the first excerpt, of course. Well, as policymakers are, of course, asking for reports. That's what we did. However, exactly these reports contain these sound files. In other words, there's less text, but an invitation to put on headphones and to listen to our recommendations. And of course, this caused problems. They thought it was rather awkward, but for us, it was a matter of principle, conveying knowledge in a different way. Now, analyzing the existing sonic situation at a particular place is one thing. But when it comes to concrete recommendations regarding certain changes in the existing sonic situation, things become more complicated. Stakeholders don't recognize or don't want to recognize the role of sound and are very quick with their objections against proposed changes. The residents, on the other hand, were extremely positive, as for the first time their concerns and aversion to the existing situation was taken seriously. So besides the more obvious recommendations, such as the reduction of traffic, here are some other ideas we included in our reports. Can we see the next slide, please? Yeah. One of the projects is about redesigning the site, which is currently a roundabout for motorized traffic, bikes and trams, with a fountain in the middle. You saw a picture of it in the previous slide. This fountain is either on or off. Although perhaps a minor intervention, our suggestion is to ask a sound artist to make a water composition to overcome the current monotony. Another project is similar to the New York High Line. That is an old railway track traversing parts of Rotterdam that should be turned into a park 6 meters above the ground. Next slide. Yeah. Underneath this park, this future park, are small shops. And one of them is a knife grinder's shop. So our idea is to install a tube going from the shop underneath the park to the park, so that people walking there can listen to the grinding. And regarding the same project, this park should of course consist of green, trees, plants, flowers, also to increase biodiversity, more or other birds, insects and small mammals. Can I go to the next slide, please? So our plan is to create at certain spots what we would call augmented reality. That is, adding artificial sounds to the already existing ones in order to attract or at least suggest this biodiversity. And again, I have two sound files to play. One, how it should sound when the park is ready. And the second one, when there is a slight difference in the composition of the sonic environment because we added some extra sounds to it. So please the first sound file, what the park should sound after it is realized. So this is how it could sound in Rotterdam, but now the same sound file with some extra artificial sounds added to it. So basically the only thing we did was to add some extra bird sounds of species that will never live in the Netherlands unless climate change keeps continuing. Then the final example and the final slide, or the next slide, let's say. Yeah. The warning signals for the trams could be more composed. For example, by creating rhythmic variations, which functions as sonic information for pedestrians and bikers. For example, how close a tram is and from which direction it comes. So these were just 4 short examples that we suggested. And this brings me to the last part of my presentation. Next slide, please. Yeah. Of course, the concrete role of sound artists here is still limited to recommend changes, to give advices, to present ideas. Nevertheless, this is already an extension of their common role. Already at a relatively early stage, they are included in the decision-making processes. Next slide. But more important, through their presence and presentations, they make clear how the aesthetic is always already connected to the political, the social, the economic, the ecological, etc. And this brings me back to what to the question that Jordan posed in his introduction: who has the right to decide how a city sounds? Their role, the role of these artists is not restricted to the pure artistic aspects anymore. That by making people aware of the sonic environment, for example, by sound walks and by these sonic impressions, by inciting people to use their ears, they refine rough prejudices. For example, that unwanted sound equals loud sound equals noise. They point at sonic differences that can be heard by changing one's position just a couple of meters. That is, they point at the constant interactions taking place between the sounding and non-sounding elements in the environment. Next slide, please. They point at the sonic variety or uniformity, at details that often go unnoticed by inexperienced listeners. The few recommendations I mentioned, work with the fountains, connect with the tube, the park visitors and the shops underneath the park, insert in very subtle ways some extra sounds, and slightly change the warning signals. These examples are modest and of course not enough to solve the problems of noise pollution due to traffic. They are part of a package that as a whole contributes to making a better sonic environment. And better is quieter, but certainly also more diverse. There are more different things to hear. Sites where nature and culture exist together, where the city's hectic meets what I would call lulling places. Next slide. I call these interventions acousmatic non-art. They can be heard as art-like phenomena, even though they might never explicitly be accorded the status of an artwork. Their position is mainly to reveal and encourage a sensitivity to the hidden characteristics and implicit values, sonic values, of a site or a situation. This type of interventions constitutes effective encounters with the inherent embedded capacities of specific sites. They reveal and activate hidden potentials of sites or objects, forgotten or suppressed forces that are already latently present in a place, thereby establishing new connections. Thank you very much, and can go to the last slide.
Well, thank you, Marcel, and two apologies. Firstly, for the technical hitch, and secondly, for destroying your original ideas, which I don't think is the case. In fact, I would say that you very generously engaged with an emerging scholar to share your ideas, and I'm appreciative of that. And thank you for sharing your, really, I guess the most present, up-to-date results of your communications with the civil servants of Rotterdam, and sharing with us those sound files and those ideas. And particularly love the way you ended with this idea of a non-art approach to reveal inherent and embedded capacities of a site. We're now going to move to Q&A, and I would invite any of you to please share some questions via YouTube that you would like me to relay to Gascia and Marcel. Hello Gascia, hello Marcel. Nice to see you on the same screen. And thank you so much, both of you, for really fascinating presentations. I do have a couple of questions that have come through, but I'm going to indulge myself by asking you one firstly. Gascia, I was struck when listening to your presentation of the way that these early noise maps attach a negativity to the sounds of the city. And the qualitative maps that you presented, how they were able to reveal race and class issues that were perhaps previously concealed by these earlier maps. Is there something here to do with? It's a bit of a platitude now, I suppose, almost, but this negative attitude towards noises that sound artists might complain about. Is there some connection there, do you think, with developing a more positive attitude to the sounds of the city? Ironically, somehow will uncover these issues that may have been previously concealed or hidden. I think I explained that a bit clumsily, but hopefully you can work with that question.
Doesn't feel clumsy, Jordan. Thank you very much for the question. And yeah, if I think about some of those early, let's say, noise maps of cities, well, first of all, they are representations of noise environments and sound levels. And there is often a, let's say, negative connotation, or at least trying to systematically account for, at the time, increasingly industrialized, urbanized places. So, for example, that decibel chart I showed was from the City Noise Report, which was commissioned by the New York City Commission on the Abatement of Noise in the early 1930s. What I wanted to show through those examples was that kind of approach to noise mapping has still predominated today in terms of how people from urban planning communities as well as city decision makers are encountering this. The idea of the acoustic city is often through that dimension. Now, Jordan, in your introductory remarks, you mentioned that the ISO has also produced these kind of more qualitative now understandings of soundscape. So the more, recommendations, as you said, for data collection on soundscape, and that includes things like sound walking with residents. So I think, there is certainly a shift towards that, but in terms of representations, graphic representations, visual representations, the kinds of data collection that are really done on a mass scale, it still does have to do with noise mitigation. And I think that really emerged at a time in the early 20th century where there was almost like a hysteria around growing city noise, because there was this much cited figure that cities were rising in terms of their sound levels at a rate of 1 decibel per year, and that eventually they would deafen all their inhabitants. And so some of that, was a kind of reaction towards an exaggerated, what we now know to be an exaggerated figure. But, at the same time, certainly that, was a growing problem. So, but anyway, sorry, to come back to your question, in what ways, was the question kind of in what ways have sound artists perhaps revealed aspects of the acoustic city that those kinds of noise mappings don't capture? Was that, or maybe you could tell me the question again. I got off slightly off track.
I don't know. No, I think you answered the question well. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. No, I very much appreciate the kinds of work that sound artists are doing, particularly around mapping and kind of developing maybe new strategies for mapping, developing different kinds of participatory processes sometimes, and in a sense resisting perhaps what become dominant representations of cities. Maybe later I will show you guys an example of a sound map of Belfast that I find very exciting. But it's just mapping the sounds of electrical hums of infrastructural kind of communications boxes in Belfast. They're kind of like parts of the urban infrastructure. I'll show you that project, but what I want to say about it is, it's a non-obvious kind of mapping, and when Belfast is always shown in a certain light as a segregated city, as a divided city, to see it in a very different way. Some of those kinds of mappings, whether they be of a, one interesting kind of sound or a different kind of participatory process in creating that map, it can actually really kind of change how you understand a place. And so for me, that's the interest in mapping, that those representations can actually really shift how a place is understood. And I do think that those representations are very important, particularly when people are speaking to people like civil servants and architects and urban planners, because they can encapsulate, kind of deeply held ideas about what a place is, whether that has to do with sound or not. And they can be, as you said, Jordan, in your comment after my talk, sites of real power, map making, and who makes the map and what's on the map. Anyway, I'll stop there for now. I know we have a lot to discuss.
Marcel, but before I do that, I said one of the points in my question also, the example is really interesting of the black communities in Washington where the sound systems were playing, and gentrification was forcing these to be removed. And yet what you showed in your presentation was these cultures of dance and celebration that it brought into the street as a consequence of what other people found to be noisy. So I guess I was interested in this reframing of noise as something negative, as something that can also be incredibly celebratory and community building. It just struck me, that particular example.
Absolutely. And I'll just say 2 words about that. For me, Ali Martin's project is so important in, shining a light on whose noise. When you're talking about something like noise, for whom is that noise? And for whom is that actually a very vibrant sonic culture, an aspect of, identity, cultural identity and social identity. It was very interesting that for me, that Don't Mute DC, it started when a resident from a new upscale development in that area lodged a noise complaint against that Metro PCS electronics store that was playing go-go music from its loudspeakers and had done so for over 20 years. And at first, the parent company of Metro PCS asked them to turn off the music, and they did, but then there were all these protests around it, and those protests triggered a lot of other kinds of responses, including eventually now go-go music is actually, officially the official music of Washington, D.C. That wouldn't have happened before those protest movement happened. But it really kind of exposed, that kind of difference, who is hearing this in what way. And I think that's something that as people who are studying soundscape and dealing with soundscapes in very diverse, sometimes cities, culturally diverse, diverse in terms of religion, race, ethnicity, class, of course, to have a more nuanced understanding of actually how people differently hear and understand, as well as experience and participate in the co-production, let's say, of soundscapes, that it's not just a kind of one, thing that defines a place, but it can be really quite varied and nuanced along those lines of social and cultural difference.
Thanks, Gascia. Marcel, really interested in this non-art idea you are proposing, and the way that you're using it rather than having an artwork in public space. It's a way of using art or non-art to reveal these embedded capacities or qualities. It's a very subtle and sophisticated approach to urban sound design. I'm wondering how your civil servants and bureaucrats are responding to or coping with this notion.
Yeah, like I said, it is hard for them. In that sense, I'm very much interested in what Gascia presented, and especially the more non-conventional ways of sound mapping. All too often, they remain very much connected to traditional mapping. So we just see a Google map and then you can click and then you have some sounds, which in my opinion are not the most interesting sound maps. But the later examples that you gave, they really transform also our relation, let's say, or the relation between the visual and the audible. So that is where mapping, in my opinion, the sonic mapping can make a difference, and actually explore and release or reveal other aspects of a certain site. Yeah, as I said, and that is where my role from academic and or artist changes to the role of politician or negotiator, is as long as you're analyzing those spaces and come up with a report where, of course, it should contain all the decibel measurements, etc. Otherwise, they don't take it very serious. But so as long as it is an analysis, they're fine with that. As when it comes to recommendations, and as you already noticed, I mean, what we're trying to do is doing very subtle interventions. So taking as point of departure usually the things that are already suggested by architects, and from there we work. Now in next projects we start at the even earlier stage. So we do first a sound walk with the architects. So to focus them immediately also on the sonic aspects of a site. But it's very hard to make to get this concretized. So because all kind of political aspects and economic aspects start playing a role, and it is interesting. It's interesting to encounter that, but it definitely means, at least for me, like leaving the ivory tower of the university and be connected to the everyday practice of what is going on in the politics of a city. Nevertheless, and that is it's interesting because there's also the pressure coming from two sides. Both first from the residents who feel first for the first time they feel heard. So we did sound walks with them. We had questionnaires with them. We did interviews. The architects don't do that. They just present their idea. So for the first time, they felt heard, and they felt that they have a voice, like perhaps the sound mapping in Washington. For the first time, they felt they had some, like some backup, some ammunition, perhaps even, so that they feel stronger. The second thing is that it attracts a lot of media attention. So the day after we gave a report to the mayor of Rotterdam, it was in several newspapers in the Netherlands. And that, of course, also increases the pressure on the politicians to do something with it. Because otherwise, I mean, they will get feedback, oh, but you see, it's the same old story. Politicians never listen to what other people are saying. And so in that sense, on the one hand, it can sometimes be frustrating that you think, but why don't you do something with our plans? On the other hand, they are actually taking them very seriously.
Thank you, Marcel. Listening to both of you talk, it strikes me how important cartography is to sound art practice or urban soundscape practices, because it reveals not just the aesthetic but the political and the social. And I mean cartography as a physical or data-driven mapping, but also as a performative mapping, such as in the act of making and creating. This word cartography is very important. Something I wasn't expecting when I set up the Sonic Cities themes, but it's come through really strongly. We're running out of time, so I've got some questions here. I'm just going to pose one to each of you from the audience, so sorry for those that I don't get to. I've got one here for you, Gascia, which I have to admit I don't fully understand, so I hope you will. Thank you, Gascia. You mentioned volumetric mapping. This seems mainly in the up, though, up in inverted commas. Is thinking about sonic urbanisms in a subterranean way of benefit to critical soundscape cartography?
I will. I hope I will interpret that question correctly. I think perhaps the question is concerning the ways in which sound mapping takes place above ground, if I'm thinking of non-subterranean, and volumetric mapping, so kind of the decibel sound level mappings are, I guess I would say a few things about them. Unlike that sound level chart of the Berlin district that I showed from 1938, which was done with, handheld noise level meters. They were doing it in fons, actually, not decibels, but that was the mode for quite a long time. It was actual decibel measurements taken in place in a very systematic way. Even the WSP, the World Soundscape Project, did that kind of noise mapping of sites using, again, handheld noise meters, and they were actual noise level measurements. But since then, since the 1980s and 1990s, it's really shifted towards predicted sound level mappings. So based on different kinds of simulations based on things like traffic movements or air traffic as well as road traffic. So there's a shift from the actual towards predicted and kind of simulated, let's say, sound level mappings. That's how most sound level mapping is happening. It's generated by software versus through actual measurements. And the other thing I'll say is that, yes, it is typically looking at a kind of horizontal versus vertical, although that kind of sound mapping is now very much possible, but still based on simulations versus actual measurements. So that's one thing I would say. If you're thinking about subterranean and maybe you're thinking there about kind of vibrations and urban places like subways and other kinds of things which are actually perhaps the human subject, and as well as many other species in urban environments are still sensing and absorbing, as they're, navigating in the city. I do think that could be a very interesting kind of way of extending the cartography of cities to kind of show those range of, let's say, sonic energies that are shaping the soundscape of a place. Sometimes they are audible, sometimes they are inaudible. We can think of a project like Christina Kubis's Electrical Walks, where she is making audible sounds that lie outside the human range of hearing. So electromagnetic waves that you can then hear when you wear her headphones. So I do think that there can be really interesting interventions looking at that kind of larger range of sound energy. And it would be very much kind of interesting to see that. And yeah, because I think those are also shaping our experiences of cities, but we're not necessarily aware of them and aware of the kinds of effects that they're having.
Very interesting question and brought out a very interesting answer, so thank you. And final question, this is one for both of you. Is it problematic that much sonic cartography is still embedded in the visual? Are there models that actively challenge the dominant audio-visual nature of sound mapping systems? I think this is a good question for both of you because, of course, Marcel, you're also presenting your sort of sound walk results and sonic interventions in a visual form. So is it problematic that sonic cartography is still embedded in the visual, and are there models that can actively challenge this dominant audio-visual nature of sound mapping systems? Marcel, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah. As I said already, I see a change in Gascia's presentation, how sound mapping changes from using like the simple Google map or the old cartographies, and then just adding some dots where you can hear something, to a more explorative and artistic idea of what a map could be. I remember quite clearly that Gascia was guest editor of one of our Journal of Sonic Studies issues, and there was one exposition in there by I forgot her name, but she mentioned an interesting Polish sound map where you don't see anything, but you just hover with your mouse over your screen, and then you can just listen to fragments. So the visual is actually is not there anymore, and that is although we had to present our reports in with a lot of text to the city council. That's why I mentioned that actually we say this is a report to which you should listen very carefully, not only on the metaphorical side, like this is very important what we have to say, but literally as well, by inserting these sound files where they have to come, these civil servants have to come out of their comfort zone and do something that they were not experienced with, namely to put on a headphone and just simply to listen, and then to build an opinion on that. So that completely changed their attitude and experience of such a report. So in that sense, although we still, and of course they are under the influence of the architects are more powerful than the sound artists still, but I think we can make a difference there when we emphasize more. Okay, and what we did with the sound walks also was, like we blindfolded them, which is so simple actually, and of course as everybody knows that it works like that, and we also know the sound composition of Francisco Lopez where he does the same, but nevertheless for them it is very, very new. It's only a very selected group who knows that blindfolding, gives an other experience. They had no idea. So in that sense, there are all kind of tricks and possibilities to make them more aware of the sonic environment where the visual is not so dominant anymore. So yes, I do think that it's very important that we keep on thinking how to promote sound and let's say a bit at the expense of the visual.
Interesting. So, and so what you're presenting us with, in a sense, there is performative approaches that aren't necessarily mapped visually, but by taking away the visual entirely and getting someone to attune with their listening in a performative sense. So, so Gascia, it'd be interesting to hear your answer in relation to your presentation that looked at maps, in particular visual maps.
Yes, and I wanted to also thank Joe for the question. I'm seeing on the YouTube chat that it was Joe who, an artist whose work I find. Oh, am I muted? No, I'm okay.
All good.
Okay. Sorry. An artist whose work I find very interesting as well. So asking about, are there models that actively challenge the dominant audio-visual nature of sound mapping systems? So thank you also to Marcel for those examples. I would say yes, coming out of the worlds of composition and sound installation, you would certainly encounter sound maps, for example, Enea Lockwood's, incredibly, I think, absorbing sound maps that she has done, particularly of rivers, the Housatonic and the Hudson River and the Danube. They're, really striking projects in which she listens and looks at many, many, many different kinds of maps of those rivers over a period of, many months. And she says, it's a very kind of slow process in which she goes and, and she's also mapping things like accents, like social aspects as well as environmental sounds. And what I really appreciate about her work, I mean, these are compositions and installations that don't necessarily have a visual dimension, is that as you're listening, you almost feel as though yeah, it's just the kind of level of detail, kind of sonic detail that she's able to kind of, elicit, let's say, from those sites and somehow capture, is really quite, for me, rare. And it does feel like a kind of, it is a mapping, it's a form of cartography, which is done, only in sound. You can think of maybe something like Chris Watson's Sheffield sound map, also of a city, in that case, which is a immersive multi-channel composition, which is, projected over multiple loudspeakers. In that case, it was the Millennium Gallery in Sheffield, but also doing a kind of mapping of the city as you're through its waterways and as you're going kind of from the outskirts to the industrial core. Again, also thinking about it as a post-industrial city and what that means and how that's reflected in, the soundscape. So I think there are, examples like that. I think the kind of visual emphasis has also been there as part of the tradition. When we look at something like the World Soundscape Project's early sound maps, I think our Marie Schaefer was thinking of creating a kind of sonic notation that would be interpretable by people in the urban professions, built environment professions, architects. He was kind of saying we need some way of representing soundscapes that can be interpreted by people across many different disciplines. And so I do see that as still kind of a predominating approach, the kind of visual aspect of it. And you also find that, as Marcel said, in the kind of Google map version of soundscapes, of sound maps. And, one of the other kinds of critiques of those maps is that they're maybe artificially fixing what is actually a dynamic phenomenon onto a map through those kinds of points. So, there's many ways in which the visual dimension of those online sound maps doesn't necessarily fully capture, those kinds of things that perhaps people working more in the sound disciplines are thinking about, and kind of flattens that visually as well. But one of the perhaps points that I wanted to make, even in drawing out the examples that I drew on, was that there are several, but one of them is that you can extend, I think, the conception of a sonic environment, not only by questioning the visual regime, which has predominated, but also thinking about the oral kinds of regimes. And the reason I find the work of people like Milena Djumeva and Samuel Tholen, also Chrissy Sterling, who contributed to that issue that Marcel mentioned of Journal of Sonic Studies, is that they do draw attention to the kind of ways in which there is an oral regime that also is operating within sound mapping practices. I think Ali Martin is also doing that in her wider work. I would point you towards other things that she has written on soundscape. And so I wanted to question what that is as well. What are the oral regimes that also predominate? And that's something I think that as sound artists and sound studies scholars and theorists, perhaps we can, do more of an unpacking of ourselves, and to think about that, how are we listening, and in what ways, does that listening privilege certain kinds of encounters with sonic environments, and also just certain understandings of sonic environments. So thank you again for the question. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Gascia, and thank you so much, Marcel. Unfortunately, we need to finish because we have run out of time. There are other questions, but hopefully in some other forum. Enjoy your days in Europe, and thank you so much for being here for the Sonic Session City today.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you, everyone.
Yep. Thanks.
And that brings us to the conclusion of our symposium. I would like to thank everybody, all the presenters and all the facilitators and the audience for tuning in today and being a part of this fascinating set of conversations. It's been a thrill for me and a delight for me as well. I just want to note to everybody that all of these recordings will remain online. They'll be uploaded to YouTube so that you can, view these for perpetuity. And very importantly, I would like to thank the extraordinary technical team who made this broadcast possible. They're sitting next door, looking at me, waiting for me to finish, I'm sure. They've been at it all day and they're incredible. Simon Maish and Ari Sharp, who've worked with all the presenters and the facilitators to make it all run as smoothly as it has. And we're very lucky to have access to the RMIT TV studios. The coordinator, who is Luke Raisbeck, and his team of Chris Yip, James Gormley and Matt Dunham, who've been extremely patient and efficient and helped us with everything today. And not to forget, again, Edward Rossi for his wonderful job designing the website. And I'd also like to acknowledge once again the Australian Research Council and the RMIT University School of Design for making all of this possible. And again, finally, and most importantly, I pay my respects to the Wurrung, Wurundjeri and Bunurong people on whose unceded lands I now stand, and where those ancient songlines continue to crisscross and vitalise this entire continent. Thank you.